Any visitor in Paris today will probably pass by the Bihacain subway station, the closest station to the Eiffel Tower. It received this name in commemoration of the victory of the French forces free in Libya over the Italian-German joint forces of General Iver Hommel. With few victories to celebrate, this commemoration of a victory of the Second World War is practically unique in France. The Second World War is not a subject that most French people want to discuss. It is much better to talk about the Great War and French heroism in Verdun. The Second World War is very complicated and ambiguous to be a source of national pride. However, it is an inevitable part of the history of France, with a legacy that both contemporary and modern scholars have been forced to deal with. This legacy gave rise to myths and many debates. Some tried to portray the occupation as the triggering of a heroic patriotic fervor, while others saw cowardice and guilt. The truth is somewhere in the middle. The defeat that France suffered in May and June 1940, although catastrophic and shocking for contemporaries, is much less interesting than its consequences. In 4 years of foreign occupation, France suffered deprivations and fear on a national scale, a destiny that shaped its present and changed its future. The invasion of Germany against Western Europe on May 10, 1940, was preceded by warning signs. During the 1930s, Hitler's Germany was rearming and openly challenging the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. However, France was desperate to face this threat, despite growing warnings. In less than 2 months, Germany conquered France. The Second World War began 8 months earlier, when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. Great Britain and France defended themselves but waited for the next German action, resulting in a period known as the War of Lies. In May 1940, the Germans crossed the Maginot Line and invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, and the Ardennes Forest instead of facing the French border. In 10 days, they reached the Atlantic coast, dividing the Allied forces. The British Expeditionary Force and part of the French army were evacuated to Dunkirk. On June 11, Paris surrendered, and 3 days later, the German army entered the capital. France was shocked to see its powerful army crumble in just 6 weeks, being the target of memes about its rapid surrender today. Thousands of civilians fled the invaded regions, overloading the southern provinces with refugees and causing a shortage of resources. This temporary exodus revealed the fragility of trade routes and the government's inability to calm the nation in times of chaos. The occupation after the French surrender on June 22 divided the country into 2 parts: the area occupied by the Germans in the north and a Fantoche regime led by the French Marshal Philippe in the south. The Germans had no time or energy to govern all of France, so the Fantoche regime was established. The Italians, who helped in the conquest of Hitler, also received a small area occupied as a reward. On June 14, 1940, when the German army entered Paris, 16 Parisians committed suicide. It is difficult to determine how many of these suicides were the result of the invasion. However, suicide historically had a Republican flavor in France, in direct opposition to Nazi totalitarianism. Thus began the German occupation of the northern areas of France. The urban areas of the occupied area, such as Paris, Tours, Bordeaux, and Dijon, were severely affected by the German presence. These cities went through a new controlled economy and a rationing system, resulting in significant changes in the local economy. The German administrative and military presence forced constant contact between 2 populations, raising the difficult question of how to deal with the occupation, collaborate, resist, or simply survive in the midst of the circumstances. Only in Paris, approximately 40,000 Germans were present from 1940. They held administrative and military positions and drastically transformed the demography and environment of the city. Although Paris had the largest concentration of Germans in France, other cities also suffered similar occupations. The changes resulting from the occupation were complex and had significant consequences. The first step of the Germans was to transform industrial and agricultural production into a controlled economy, with a rationing system. This generated inflation and gave rise to black markets that supplied goods unavailable in the official market, often with exorbitant prices. In addition, wage controls aggravated the economic crisis, resulting in scarcity and high demand. The German presence in the urban areas raised the question of how to act in the face of the occupation. There were different degrees of economic collaboration and forms of resistance. However, most French citizens did not fit clearly into these categories, seeking simply to survive and overcome the occupation in peace. The most shocking was the prohibition of showing hostility to the occupants, giving them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. Thousands of German soldiers rapidly invaded Paris, occupying famous hotels such as headquarters of Reich's military and political organizations. In addition, the exchange rate between the German franc and the German mark was fixed at 20-1, allowing German soldiers to stock up on cheese and wine. The officers were also no different, requiring supplies from the French people. Trains left France daily loaded with luxury items, exotic foods, and valuable works of art. During the occupation, anarchy and the lack of social structure facilitated the increase of crime. The borders between the police and the criminals were increasingly confused due to the black market. Often, the authorities closed their eyes to the activities of the black market and even participated in them. The jurisdiction also became problematic during the occupation. The French police forces often interfered to prove their competence and gain autonomy. However, they were actually just doing the dirty work of the SS and then lost control of the situation. It was the French police, and not the German, who was responsible for gathering the Parisian Jews in July 1942 and putting them in a cycling center around Paris where they awaited their fate in a collective misery comparable to the post-Hurricane Katrina period. The Nazi officers imposed a curfew in the nation, prohibiting any activity between midnight and 6 in the morning. The curfew, which was used as a form of control and subjugation of the population, was anticipated several times as a response to acts of civil disobedience. False police officers took advantage of the climate of chaos and impunity. They pretended to be law enforcement officers to extort bribes, rob, and threaten the population. This practice depended on anonymity and flourished especially in the big cities. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 800 robberies committed by false police officers were registered in the capital. Urban life during the occupation was dominated by a list of prohibited behaviors. It was forbidden to manifest hostility against the Germans, offer help to former French soldiers, or anyone trying to cross to the free zone. Exposure to foreign propaganda was strictly prohibited, either by radio or through communication with hostile countries to the Reich. The possession of hidden weapons was prohibited, as well as less obvious acts of subversion, like taking pictures outdoors, gathering without express permission, or displaying flags. One of the most striking characteristics of the urban occupation was the physical presence of the Germans. They occupied large civilian buildings, such as schools and seminaries, to create administrative centers. Many organizations ceased to function, and the daily life of the French was especially affected by the housing of German soldiers in their homes. This represented a constant invasion of the lives of French citizens and a daily reminder of their precarious circumstances. Urban centers were the initial cradle of resistance, although as the war progressed, it became an increasingly rural movement. However, before 1942, the resistance within France was mainly northern and urban, concentrated in cities such as Paris or Tours. The pre-1942 urban resistance had not yet acquired a great degree of organization, and instead, it was mainly limited to isolated incidents. The cut of cables was a particularly common act of sabotage. These cables facilitated the smooth operation of the German military machine. The pitchesau was also prevalent. The phrase, "under the government of Vichy," appeared already in 1940 in Dijon, flickering on a wall near a public square. As the war progressed, the V of victory began to appear in Dijon and other cities. Clearly, none of these acts of vandalism represented a real threat to German soldiers. The communication cables were quickly replaced, and the pichadas did not represent a real danger, but its importance was in its symbolism. The Germans responded to these actions with collective fines and occasionally with violent retaliation, but somehow its symbolic power diminished. Fritz Sauckel was appointed by Hitler as the general plenipotentiary for the employment of labor during the Second World War. His responsibility was to guarantee foreign labor for the Reich at any cost. Sauckel started his program called Releve, and this program was in cooperation with the government of Vichy. The idea was to send French workers to Germany in exchange for the release of French prisoners. This strategy aimed at promoting the program and transforming work in Germany into an act of patriotism. Although Releve had brought about 250,000 volunteers by the end of 1942, it was still below the expected quota. In February 1943, Sauckel pressured the Vichy government to endorse the compulsory labor service known as Santo, mandatory labor service. This required that all healthy men between 18 and 50 years old, and all single women between 21 and 35 years old, were forced to do any work that the government considered necessary, no matter how hard it was. It didn't matter how the Vichy government tried to mask this new scheme, there was no way to hide its true nature as a slave labor program. The introduction of the STO was the breaking point for the French people, leading to the increase of resistance and the formation of the MOCs, which were the resistance groups in rural areas. The German policy of collective punishment led to the execution of entire families in case a member of the resistance was identified. With the advance of the occupation, this policy became an indiscriminate retaliation, resulting in common valleys and deserted villages where the inhabitants were massacred by the SS or Gestapo. In addition, the French collaborators known as MOCs were even more insidious. They formed a paramilitary force that worked together with the occupiers and the Vichy government to keep the French under control. Some police officers were far-right fascists already existing before the war, while others were attracted by the advantages offered, such as better rations and exemption from compulsory service. Torture was frequently used by interrogators to obtain information from the suspects of resistance, leading directly to the massacres committed during the occupation. However, the collaborators realized that their cooperation would not go unpunished. In June 1944, the Normandy landings broke German dominance over France, with the resistance playing a significant role in isolating the German forces in the region. Operation Dragon, started a month later in the south of the country, forced the German withdrawal from the occupied territories. In Paris, the resistance got an arsenal of German weapons, including tanks, as the chaos spread. The news of the struggle reached the Allies, resulting in crowds infuriated in the streets. A French armored division arrived in the capital, leading to the ready surrender of the Nazi governor. During the occupation, the French industry became strongly interconnected and dependent on the German industry. In 1941, about 7,000 French companies were meeting German orders, both civil and military, a number that doubled until 1944. This German demand revitalized the French industry, which received 70 to 90% of its orders from Germany. Renault, for example, one of the main car manufacturers in France, started a partnership with the Germans shortly after the armistice, seeking permission to produce for the German Air Force. Despite France being officially neutral, producing war machines to be used against its former allies was worrying. Therefore, it was established that French companies could produce tanks, submarines, and planes, but without armaments. However, this did not prevent the weapons from being added later to production, and France played a fundamental role in the supply of weapons to the German war machine. At its peak, French factories produced up to 800 planes a month. Economic collaboration was closely linked to the urban experience of the occupation. Most of the French industries were concentrated in the north, which became the occupied zone. The main cities in the north, where Renault was located, were affected. The Germans exercised significant control over the French industry, forcing the closure of about 1,500 factories until June 1942, mainly in the Paris region. These factories, such as paper, ceramic, fabric, and furniture, distracted the efforts of war and wasted essential resources. In addition to economic collaboration, there were also personal relationships between German soldiers and French women. Although it is not possible to determine the extent of these relationships, they were more common in urban areas, where the Germans were more present. Paris, for example, housed about 40,000 Germans in 1940. These relationships were widely considered collaboration, and the women involved faced harsh reprisals after the liberation. Estimates of the number of Frenchmen executed by collaboration during the war vary, but approximately 10,000 individuals were probably victims of this punishment. Subsequently, judgments known as legal purges occurred. Curiously, those who managed to avoid justice on their own ended up being interned in concentration camps, initially built by the Vichy government. In addition, France suffered great damage to its infrastructure due to Allied bombings prior to the liberation, resulting in about 150 civilians killed during the occupation. From these statistics, an impressive 30,000 people were executed directly by the Germans for various crimes against the regime, while another 60,000 fought and died with the resistance during the occupation of France in World War II. The country's economy was significantly affected, mainly due to the introduction of a rationing system imposed by the Nazis. This system controlled the distribution of consumer goods, including food, clothing, and tobacco. Ration cards determined the amount of food each person could receive weekly, resulting in a significant reduction in the population's caloric intake. However, due to the scarcity caused by the rationing system, the black market developed in response to the widespread need for goods. This illegal market involved exchanges and negotiations outside the official distribution system, with much higher prices than those established by the government. People resorted to different strategies to obtain products in the black market, including the shipment of food packages from relatives in the field, the exchange of ration cards, and the purchase of counterfeit goods. In addition, the black market was not limited to food. There was also a demand for fake ration cards, which worked as a form of currency and were frequently stolen or negotiated in the black market. Other products such as leather, coal, and tobacco were also scarce and subject to German requisition, leading to creative substitutions, such as the manufacture of shoes and alternative materials, and the use of herbs and dry grass to produce a mixture similar to tobacco. Despite attempts to control through the rationing system, scarcity persisted, especially in relation to basic foods such as meat, bread, and potatoes. The population resorted to extreme measures, such as the hunt of wild animals and the adoption of a diet with improvised substitutes. The black market and the rationing system, along with the creativity and resilience of the French people, became fundamental elements of life during the occupation. During the war, transport was affected with a shortage of gasoline and restrictions on the number of cars on the roads. The French began to use bicycles as an alternative. The shortage caused physical and psychological repercussions, with lower children due to malnutrition and increased diseases. The concern for daily survival paralyzed the development of an effective resistance. The occupation caused humiliation, with a focus on individual needs instead of the well-being of France. The search for food dominated the newspapers and evidenced class differences. A black market emerged where the exchanges were based on reciprocity. In Dijon, the occupation began with a supply crisis because the peasants refused to send products to the markets. Rumors circulated about prices imposed by the Germans. Rumors circulated as the alleged illegality of sending potatoes to Paris. The lack of food worsened over time, leading to the closure of shops and confectionaries. Queues became part of the daily life of the inhabitants of the cities during the occupation. Rationing cards were necessary, but those with priority cards could avoid the long queues, leaving few resources for others. The queues also served as social and political forums where information and rumors were shared. Price control and rationing were not effective, while wages remained stagnant. Prices continued to rise while wages fell, making food inaccessible to two-thirds of the population. The devaluation of the currency over the German domain also aggravated the economic situation. A French historian writes that between 1940 and 1944, the average French citizen spent most of his time trying to find something to put on the dinner table. Perhaps this does not present the most honorable or exciting image of the cities in France during the war, but it gives us a realistic image. The image of the majority of the French was that of a survivor who was neither heroic nor totally inept but adapted to difficult circumstances. Urban life in occupied France was full of uncertainties. How to deal with the Germans with whom one was forced to meet throughout the day. What to do if the supply of electricity runs out, as it almost always happened. Position yourself ideologically, supporting collaborators or the resistance. How to stretch wages in a controlled decline economy. And more importantly, how to navigate this economy to survive and live during the war. If this content has aggregated you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the bell so you don't miss any news. See you soon.